Set up for giants, I think. All right. Well, hello, everyone. I know people are still filtering in. Some of you want to continue to get food. That is perfectly fine. If you need to grab another drink or grab some food, do so. Do it quietly. My name is James Scholes. I am the head of the Education Liberty Branch in the IGC, the Institute for Governance and Civics. And the IGC, if you're not familiar, we aim to be the nation's premier policy institute in creating the next generation of effective citizens and responsible leaders. And we do that by advancing constitutional, economic, conscience, and educational liberty through bold research, transformative teaching, and fearless debate. And in the spirit of debate, we have a whole bunch of events coming up. If you haven't gotten a copy of our events list, you should do so. October 24th, we have the Founders and Religion and Creating the Constitution. November 4th, Daniel DiMartino, How Socialism Destroyed Venezuela. November 18th, Glenn Loury, The Case for Black American Patriotism. And November 19th, I'm particularly excited about because we'll be back here and I will be talking about my forthcoming book, Fighting for the Freedom to Learn. So we also have a whole bunch of movies scheduled over the course of the next year. This coming summer, or summer 2026, is, we're celebrating America's 250th. And so as we prepare for America 250, we've got a bunch of Americana films that we're going to be showing here in the FSU movie theater, also at the IMAX at the Challenger Learning Center. So all of these events are on our website. Check it out. We also have essay competitions that we're going to be launching soon, student scholarship opportunities, research opportunities. You've probably met maybe some of our ambassadors. Raise your hand if you're one of our intern ambassadors. Right? So we have a lot of opportunities for students to engage with what we're doing, to attend lectures and talks. Some of you, I think, might be getting extra credit for coming today, which thank your professors. If you registered out front, we will share that list with the professors. If you didn't register, make sure you write it down. Leela has a piece of paper, and I'll get your name and share that with the professors who are giving extra credit. All right, on to our topic for today. So our speaker is Vlad Kogan. So who exactly is Vlad Kogan? I say that exactly like that because a few years ago, Vlad got into a little bit of trouble. He was digging into teacher attendance data and found in the Columbus city schools in Ohio that teachers had, in many cases, had worse attendance than the students had. And he published that, and it didn't make him any friends in the teachers union and among the educators. And so they commissioned a hit piece on him, and they said, so who exactly is Vlad Kogan? So as the Columbus Free Press wrote, he's a father of 2 children who attend Columbus City schools, and he regularly shows up at school board meetings. This is where you cue the dun, dun, dun music, right? So what I've discovered about Dr. Kogan is that he is dogged in his pursuit for the truth, using data to explore empirical questions. So he's a professor of political science at Ohio State University. His research focuses on the intersection of politics and public policy. His work has been published in top scholarly journals, including American Political Science Review, American Journal of Political Science, Journal of Policy Analysis and Management, and I could go on. But most importantly, he's here talking about his latest book, which many of you received a copy of today, No Adult Left Behind, How Politics Hijacks Education Policy and Hurts Kids. Would you welcome Dr. Kogan?
Well, thank you for that introduction, and thank you all for coming. Just a quick show of hands. How many of you are in Hans Hassel's class and are here for extra credit? That's great. So Hans and I went to graduate school together at UC San Diego. And how many of you are in James Strickland's class and you're here for extra credit? All right, so it's great. So I presented a chapter from this book at a conference 2 years ago, and James was actually my discussant, and he offered some critical, biting comments on the chapter that made it better. So I'm really glad you're here. Thank you to James for inviting me and to Rhinones. And if this is your first IGC event, I hope you come to many more. Again, I'm really excited to be here and part of this event. So I am an empirical scholar. Usually, if I gave a talk, there'd be a lot of charts and regression tables. There's not going to be any of that in my presentation today. Because what I want to do is really kind of give you the big argument, the big idea in this book. And I want to warn you ahead of time, it's going to be controversial, I think, and some of you might actually find it a little bit offensive. So I'd love pushback. I love questions. I do have some Q&A built in, but please interrupt with questions throughout. Don't wait for the Q&A. And so the title of the presentation is The Gerrymandering of K-12 Education, and which is not the title of the book. And you'll see what I mean. So how many of you have heard about gerrymandering and the debates about gerrymandering in the last few months? So it's great. So you probably heard about this. So there's been efforts at a variety of states to change congressional districts, starting in Texas by Republicans, that went to California amongst Democrats. Yesterday, North Carolina announced that they're going to hold a special session to change their congressional districts. And about a month ago, your local newspaper was talking about, is Florida going to be next? Are we going to be changing our congressional districts as well? So I think this is how we often think about gerrymandering. It's changing congressional districts for political power. I'm going to talk to you about a totally different kind of gerrymandering that I think is actually profoundly much more consequential and much more longer standing, and I think actually much harder to address. And it's really the gerrymandering that I think is actually kind of built into how we govern schools. And so I divided the presentation into two parts. So I want to spend about 20 minutes just giving you the argument, and this is going to be the depressing part of the presentation. This is going to be all bad news about everything that's wrong. And maybe we'll pause and I'll take your harsh questions and criticism. And then if we have time at the end, I have 3 slides on solutions, on what can we do to address these issues. That maybe we can leave the talk on a more positive note. Okay, and there's some opportunities for audience participation. So please jump in. So the first question I have for you is coming up. So a core part of my argument is that Chief Justice Earl Warren. How many of you have heard of Earl Warren? Okay, so he was Chief Justice from 1953 to 1969. One of probably the most influential Chief Justices in United States history. Many of the cases that you've heard of, Supreme Court cases, come from that period. But my core argument is that on this particular issue, Earl Warren was wrong. And so when he retired in 1969, every time he'd do an interview with a journalist, they would ask him, like, what was the most important case from your time on the court? And there was, again, a lot of cases. What would you think he would have answered to that question? Again, there's tons of pivotal cases decided during the Warren period. What do you think was his answer to what is the most important case that you decided? Brown versus Board of Education? Megan, were you going to say that? So that is what everybody thought he would say, and that was not his answer. That was not his answer, even though that's what everybody expected. And here's why. He said, the accolade should go to the case Baker v. Carr, which was the progenitor of the one man, one vote rule. And Baker v. Carr, so before this decision, when we had redistricting, we had gerrymandering, but a different kind of gerrymandering, where there was malapportionment, where often big urban areas would have many more people in a district than rural areas. And as a result, they would have a lot less political power because they elected fewer members of the state legislature. And of course, those urban areas in the South were primarily where African Americans were living. And so this, in effect, also had the effect of diluting African American votes. And so here's what he said. He said, if we had already had universal voting, then we wouldn't have had many of the problems that Brown versus Board of Education attempted to correct. Many of our problems would have been solved a long time ago if everyone had the right to vote and his vote counted as everyone else's. And that was the core principle of Baker v. Carr, Reynolds v. Sims, and the one man, one vote decisions. Okay? And so, and his view is if we had fixed politics, if we had equality in political power, then the schools would have been fine. We would not have had segregated schools. We would not have had second-class schools for African-American children. And so we wouldn't have even needed the Brown decision because the problems would have fixed themselves. And so really the core argument in the book is that I think that's fundamentally wrong. And the theory, and as a political scientist, I think this is often our intuition, that if we have widespread voting rights for adults, then they would use that voting rights, those voting rights, to bring about high-quality education for children. I think that's the core intuition for Justice Warren. And I think I want to convince you that that is not the case. And in fact, that was already not the case when he made this comment. That was not the case when the Brown decision was heard. And I want to give you just a couple of anecdotes to illustrate what I mean. So 50 years before Brown versus Board of Education, there was an African-American gentleman who was elected to the Indiana State Legislature in 1897. And he was the only African-American in office. He had kind of interesting history. He had been a police officer, a tax collector, a deputy county recorder, but his real passion was education. He had gone to work as a teacher and then as a principal in Indianapolis. And Indiana in the 1800s actually had segregated schools. They had the option of having segregated schools. So he's elected in 1997. He's only in office for a year. And he says, what is the one thing I can do to have the biggest positive impact for my constituents, the African-American community in Indianapolis? I know I'm going to pass a law desegregating schools or banning segregated schools in Indianapolis. So he puts forward a bill, and it flies through the legislature. There's like no opposition. It goes through committee. All the white members love it. In fact, they love it so much, they amend it to add criminal penalties for having segregated schools. So it seems like it's going to pass. There's literally no opposition. And then one day, Representative Jones comes into the office, and in the mail are two petitions from his constituents. And one is a petition against this bill. And it reads, if such a bill becomes a law, we believe that it will be detrimental to the colored people of the state, that it will deprive not only ourselves, but many colored men and women of their livelihood, and that it will remove the opportunity that colored men and women now have to strive after and obtain honorable employment in the public schools. Because one thing that I think increasingly scholars have recognized is when we had segregated schools, although they were highly unequal, they actually employed a lot of African Americans. And if you looked in the South before Brown, there's actually more African American teachers in the South in the segregated schools than there was in the North in the non-segregated schools. And there was concerns amongst the educators about what would happen. Oops, forgot to give you the quote. There it is. What would happen to our jobs if you desegregated? Well, we might lose our jobs. There was a second petition, and that was written also by prominent African Americans in Indianapolis. These were some of the most wealthy and highly educated. And they said, no, we need this legislation. They said, Indiana is alone of all the northern states in keeping up this discrimination against colored children. We ask no special or class legislation, but simply that the class legislation on our statute books be removed. And so there was these two competing petitions claiming to be speaking on behalf of the African American community. And all the white legislators like, well, we don't know what to do. Who is really speaking for African Americans? Like, is this a good bill that we thought we were going to pass, or is it a bad bill? So to get help, they reach out to a man named George Knox, who was the publisher of the Indianapolis Freeman, which is at the time the largest African American newspaper in the country. Happens to be in Indianapolis. And they go to him and they say, Mr. Knox, what is your advice? Do we pass the bill, desegregate the schools, or do we keep the segregated schools that happen to employ a lot of middle-class African Americans? And his advice was unequivocal. He said, and this is from a history book about this period, he spoke against the adoption of the law because its enforcement would put so many Negro educators out of work. And the bill died. And it was not because of opposition from white legislators. It was because of the guidance they got from prominent leaders in the African American community concerned about jobs. Now, again, this happened in 1897. Jones is no longer in office. He's the last African American to serve for the next 30 years. Schools in Indianapolis remain segregated for another 40 years after this. So in 1953, so this is right as the Supreme Court is hearing Brown versus Board of Education, many of the same debates are happening across the country. And there are prominent African Americans saying, this is the right thing to do. African American children deserve a good education. But there's other people who are saying, but what about the teachers? And so this is an article published in 1953 in Nation magazine by a sociologist named Oliver Cox. And he says the teachers are going to be the martyrs to integration. And he says, while some selfless champions of our democracy may think that their employment and that of others are nothing compared to the achievement of integration, this position seems to me in general unsound. Freedom to work is at least as sacred as the right to non-discrimination in education. Indeed, education itself will have decreasing value if the occasion to employ it is increasingly limited. So this is some of the context. And so the court hears the case. It's called Brown versus Board of Education. There's a great book by Richard Kluger. It's 900 pages called Simple Justice. It's an amazing book, worth your time. After you read my book, read Richard Kluger's book. And so does anybody know, so the case is called Brown versus Board of Education. That's not the full name. Does anybody know what the full name of the case was? And this is actually pretty interesting, pretty important. Yeah. Yeah, it's Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka. And that's important because you might wonder, well, why is it Topeka? Why wouldn't it be Wichita, which is the largest city in Kansas, and also the state capital? Well, it turned out it was supposed to be Wichita. And so the effort to desegregate schools in Kansas, it began with the efforts of a Jewish white woman named Esther Brown in a small area called South Park. She was driving one of her domestic workers home, saw the school that her kids were going to, said, this is outrageous. And integrated South Park schools, it was a tiny community, said, all right, next we're going to do the state capital. We're going to go to Wichita, and we're going to integrate the schools in Wichita. Except when she got to Wichita, it turned out that there was not much interest in Wichita in integrating the schools. So this is a quote from Simple Justice. Flushed with the victory in South Park, Esther Brown pushed the NAACP in Wichita, the biggest city in Kansas, to launch a suit against segregation. But she was beaten by the teachers who feared for their jobs. So the opposition of the teachers who were concerned about employment actually shut down legislation, said, all right, well, I can't sue in Wichita. Let me go to Topeka, see if they're interested. So Topeka was a little bit different. And even in Topeka, the teachers were also very concerned. So this is another quote from Simple Justice. That little leadership came from the blacks best trained to supply it was particularly apparent amongst the 36 or so colored public school teachers in Topeka, who wanted no part in any drive to desegregate the grade schools. But unlike Wichita, where African-American teachers were very active in the NAACP, they were actually not very active in Topeka, so their opposition did not have much of an impact. It was hardly surprising then that the NAACP reorganized itself in Topeka after the war, and at the time, no black teachers joined it. It was a threat to them in more ways than one. Most obvious was the growing interest in ending segregated schools. So this is some of the context for what's happening in the 1950s. And I want to bring it now up to kind of the present and to show you some parallels where I think the intuition for what was going on, which is, I think, the intuition that conflicts with Chief Justice Warren's intuition about how this would work is actually very much relevant today. So the day that Brown versus Board of Education is decided, there's actually 4 other cases. So it's not just the Kansas case, there's 4 other cases. One of those is different because it's a case out of Washington, D.C., which is not a state. It's a federal territory. So the legal theory under which the Brown case is decided doesn't apply in Washington, D.C. But the D.C. case is really interesting because it's about a school named John Philip Sousa Junior High School. And it's named after a prominent American composer. And it's built in 1950. It's a brand new school, and it's an all-white school. And it's under-enrolled. And it is in southeastern Washington, D.C., right next to African-American schools that are over capacity. And so in this case, there's 12 families that try to get their African-American children enrolled at John Sousa Middle School, and they're turned away, and this gives rise to the case that is part of the package of Brown versus Board of Education, where schools are struck down, where segregation is struck down. Schools are integrated in DC, they're integrated in Topeka. And so I want to now fast forward to kind of more of the present. And so if Chief Justice Warren was right, if we had political power, equal political power, then we would have advocacy for students, we would have good schools. And again, if the concern is about racial inequities, we would presumably have racial inequities. And I think Washington, D.C. is an interesting example. So Washington, D.C. happens to be a city that's one of the first cities to have a majority black electorate. So it gets the nickname Chocolate City because it's a city that has a lot of prominent African-American political leadership. And in 1979, a civil rights leader who's actually the former president of the school board, Marion Barry, is elected president. And again, if Chief Justice Warren is right, then this should bring about better education. It turns out it does not. So DC schools actually struggle. And one of the apparent concerns is it seems like DC schools are being used primarily as an adult employment agency rather than as an education agency. And one of the controversial policies that Marion Barry puts into place is actually a minority contracting requirement. It says all city business, including the school district, initially 25% of all the contracts have to go to minorities and then 35%. And this is a big problem because the district doesn't have any extra money, and it turns out the contracts they're getting from minority contractors cost more money. So the superintendent at the time is an African-American gentleman named Vince Reed. He goes to the mayor and says, Mr. Mayor, we don't have the money to do this. He said, I understand that you want to give contracts to black companies, but when you tell me to take food out of the black kid's stomach so some black dude can get rich, I have to ask you, what's your rationale? And Mayor Barry responds, black entrepreneurs are at the top of my agenda. We have to do it this way. This is the only way to get them into the mainstream. So this is kind of the state of education in DC. In the 1990s, Washington, D.C. has a big budget crisis. The federal government takes over and brings in a financial responsibility and management assistance agency. They put out a report called Children in Crisis on the state of Washington, D.C. schools. And they write, the deplorable record of the district public schools by every impartial educational and management measure has left one of the city's most important public responsibilities in a state of crisis, creating an emergency which can no longer be ignored or excused. District of Columbia Public Schools is failing its mission to educate the children of District of Columbia. In 2003, the Council of the Great City Schools, which is a membership organization for the big urban districts, so not necessarily, an organization that has harsh things to say about its members, puts out a report that says DC is, quote, one of the lowest performing big city school districts in the nation. And in 2006, there's a new mayor elected. He's a councilman named Adrian Fenty, and he wants to transform public education in DC. And so one of the first things he does is he asks city council, and they approve, giving the mayor all the power over education, eliminating the superintendent, and allowing the mayor to directly control the schools, which he does. And so that brings us to really the modern era. Adrian Fenty hires a new chancellor of education, a woman named Michelle Rhee, who is from not from DC. She's actually from Dayton, Ohio. She's on the cover of Time magazine, gets a lot of attention during her tenure as chancellor of DC city schools. There's a really great book. So after you read my book, after you read Simple Justice, read The Bee Eater, which is a fantastic account in real time of what it's like in DC during Michelle Rhee's reign. And there's tremendous change. Just about 4 years ago, the Arnold Foundation actually commissioned a rigorous study comparing what happened in DC as a result of the reforms under Michelle Rhee, and DC is transformed. It goes from being one of the lowest performing urban schools in the country, systems in the country, to one of the fastest growing by the end of this period. And so there's a lot of change happening, and it turns out, again, the reason why I bring it back to the Brown case, the very school that was at the heart of the desegregation lawsuit is now actually also at the heart of the Michelle Rhee turnaround effort. So there's still the John Sousa Middle School, and it is widely known that it is kind of a terrible school. So I don't know if you can see, but I'll read you the caption. This is an article in 2010 published by the Washington Post by a journalist named Stephanie McCruman, and she says Sousa is one of the few middle schools in Washington to substantially improve student test scores. And it used to have some of the lowest results in the city. Now it's a model for others. And I want to just read you a couple of quotes before and after what's going on in Sousa before Michelle Rhee takes over and now. So this is before. Privately, one faculty member at another school called it, quote, a dumping ground for burnt out teachers, a place toxic with low expectations where students roamed the halls and fought. 80% of the Southeast school students are from low-income families, 99% are African American, and most come from the neighborhoods where violence, drugs, and other uncertainties invade childhoods. When DC Schools Chancellor Michelle Rhee appointed the new principal to take over the freshly renovated school 2 years ago, only 23% of its students were proficient in reading, 17% were proficient in math. So she brings in a new principal, DeJuan Jordan. One of the first things he does is he fires 2/3 of the teachers. And so here's the after quote. Described by a former colleague as a very, 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 I can't say enough, very competitive, Principal DeJuan Jordan fired most of the staff and pushed through some changes in his first year. The teachers union fought him. Some parents asked for his dismissal. Then the test results came in. Reading proficiency rose to 39%, math to 42%. Although these lagged behind some DC public charter schools, Sousa's gains were the biggest of any public middle school in the city last year, and they have drawn attention. So you have, before, the lowest performing middle school in one of the lowest performing districts in the country is now one of the fastest improving middle schools. And in 2010, Adrian Fenty is running for re-election as mayor. And it is clear that the election is going to be a referendum on his education record. And if Earl Warren is right, he should be rewarded for improving schools and providing a quality education for African-American children. And so I'm going to play you a clip this is on election night. This is CNN analyzing the results and gives you kind of a sense of what's going on in DC.
CNN, weeknights 7 Eastern.
One of the big primary contests this night is right here in the District of Columbia. This is the incumbent mayor, Democrat Adrian Fenty. This is his prime challenger. There are several challenges, but the city council chairman, Vince Gray, is the prime challenger right now. And we want to show you something interesting about this mayor, because if you ask people in the District of Columbia, how are things going? Look at this. 64% of residents of the District of Columbia say that positive things have happened under Mayor Fenty. So you would think this guy would be in good shape for an incumbent, but he is not. And let's take a look at why. And here's one of the issues here. When people are asked in the wards, we look at the wards right here. Rich people live up here in the Northwest, poorer people down here. There is a huge racial and economic divide in the city right now, and that is what is driving the politics. Vince Gray, running against Mayor Fenty, says he has stopped caring about the African-American base, caters too much to more wealthy white voters in this part of the state. A big defining issue from is education reform. The teachers union is spending a lot of money because Michelle Rhee is Mayor Fenty's handpicked school chancellor. A few months back, she fired more than 200 teachers. She says if test scores don't improve, she will hold the teachers accountable and fire them. She was on this program a short time ago. She says she knows she's controversial. She doesn't really care.
No, I'm not here to be well liked. I don't care about being popular. Mayor Fenty brought me here to fix the school system. And in order to do that, you've got to make some incredibly hard decisions that sometimes rankle, people. And for me, that's okay as long as I feel like I'm serving the children well.
Fenty loses. Fenty loses, and it's like a blowout loss. I guess national attention. It is clear that this is all about education. This is a referendum on education. It's a referendum on what's happening at Sousa Middle School. And in fact, Sousa Middle School is a voting site in this election. So people are voting in this election at the school. Richard Whitmire, who's the journalist who wrote the beater, goes to the school to interview voters. He's like, I can't find a single person who voted for Adrian Fenty. Literally cannot find a single person at the precinct of the school that is now the fastest improving school. Not a single person wants to vote for the incumbent. He's so puzzled by this, he actually commissions a professional survey firm for his book to go out and survey voters in Ward 7, where the school is located, to figure out what is going on. Like, why is this not winning him any votes? And so this is a survey done a week after the election. And I'm just going to show you a couple of slides just to conclude from the survey that I think really illustrate why Earl Warren got it wrong. So here's the first question. Did public schools in Ward 7 improve under Michelle Rhee? And so this is all respondents, all residents of Ward 7. These are just voters who have kids in the school. And look at this last column. These are just voters who not only have kids in schools, but they have kids in this school, the fastest improving school. And you can see they see the improvement, right? Again, in the whole ward, 33% of voters say the schools got better. 28% say it got worse. In Sousa, 2-to-1 saying the school got better. So the voters are seeing the improvement. The parents are seeing the improvement. So then they ask, are DC public schools moving in the right direction? And look, at Sousa middle school parents, 75% say yes, the schools are getting better. Ward-wide, 58% say the schools are getting better. Then they say, well, I support Mayor Fenty's school reforms, but I oppose the methods he used to get them. And here, you have now more people agreeing with the statement than disagreeing, including amongst Sousa parents. 47% agree that the schools are getting better, but they don't like the methods. So then they ask, what is it about the methods? And in particular, did you think firing and replacing the teachers at Sousa Middle School was needed to make the school better? And amongst parents of the school, again, now more parents are saying, no, you should have kept the teachers. Firing the teachers was not necessary to improve the schools. Now, everybody new to the school says that's crazy. There's no way this is true. And in fact, in the book, Whitmire actually talks to some of the other principals. And so here's what he says. Only 22%, this is from the poll, thought it was necessary to fire and replace Sousa teachers. Yet when I toured Sousa and I talked to Jordan, the principal, I talked to teachers and curriculum coaches, it seemed clear that keeping the old staff wasn't an option. That observation became even clearer when I visited schools nearby where principals haven't changed staffs for years, that consisted for years of teachers no other school would touch. In those places, proficiency rates in math and reading still linger below 20%. You would think that would unleash a political backlash, such low achievement. But that's not what got voters in Sousa precinct angry. Reform did, at least. Reform that involved firing teachers. Mayors, beware. And he says, mayors, beware, because the last question they asked is, who did you vote for in the mayoral race? And amongst Sousa parents, the parents who said the school's gotten better, again, worst performing school to fastest growing school, Fenty gets 16% of the vote. His opponent, Vincent Gray, gets 70% of the vote. And so I think, again, going back to Justice Warren, I think we should really kind of ask the question. If reforming and turning around one of the worst schools in one of the lowest performing districts and turning into one of the fastest improving, if that costs you your job, if you can't get reelected on that platform, where else possibly, under what circumstances, could an elected official get reelected, improving public education, if it means expensive adult jobs? And so when I say that public education is gerrymandered, That's what I mean. I mean that we have a governance system that's really set up to serve the interests of adults through the governance process that we have created. And when there are conflicting interests, so again, not always, many cases, what's good for teachers is good for students. We have created a system that when those conflicting interests come into play, we have stacked the deck in favor of the adult interest. Now, in this case, it's really about employment. That's only a small part of the story. I think there's many other examples in the book that I try to illustrate where I think the same kind of tensions come into play. And over again, we see the same thing. Adult interests trump what's good for students because kids don't vote, adults do. And unlike the theory of Justice Warren, most of the adults don't actually care about student outcomes if it means giving up on something else. So what is that something else? So I have some analysis of adult culture wars on, you can imagine, the most polarizing issues of the day, history, mascots, LGBT-related issues. And one thing I find is that when districts engage in those kind of conflicts, it comes at the expense of learning. It's so disruptive, it often ends up in superintendents getting fired, student achievement declines, but the adults are willing to fight these battles anyway. And one of the reasons why they are is, if you look empirically, we have a lot of data about who votes in local elections over the control of schools. Most of the voters, especially in low turnout off-cycle elections, are not parents, right? They actually, and they're not parents of school-age children. They may have been parents 20 years ago, but for the most part, they're elderly seniors who don't have much skin in the game, right? For them, the quality of the education is really an abstract topic. It's not going to affect them. It's not going to affect their kids. It might affect their property values, but for them, it's really a symbolic issue. And so there's also, again, when we think about housing values, there are what I call educational NIMBYs. In the same way we have NIMBYs that make housing unaffordable because they're protecting property values, turns out we see the same dynamics in schools where voters trying to protect the value of their home bring about educational policies that are just really terrible for kids. And so that's the big picture argument. And this is what I mean by gerrymandering and why we have gerrymandered K-12 education. And it's the same problem that, again, we've had many years ago. And I think our intuition that the way to solve it is to give voters power. That's the intuition that Earl Warren has. I think it's fundamentally wrong because it assumes that voters are going to care about student outcomes when there are trade-offs involved, and those trade-offs involve adults. And I think almost always we see the opposite, that when there are adults versus academic learning and student opportunity, voters are going to prioritize mostly the adult interests. So let me pause here, open it up to questions, and then I do have, that's the negative part of the presentation, and then I'll in a couple of minutes, maybe turn to the positive. And so see if there's any comments, questions, reactions. I know James said he was going to have the hardest question to try to throw me off. Yeah.
Not about clapping and applauding, but about actually trying to engage and ask speakers questions, to challenge their ideas, not always accept their ideas. So I understand the premise of what you're saying, that we favor adults in the system. But you were saying that's bad. And you were making a qualitative sort of statement without actually even saying anything about it. So why should I believe you, or why should I care that student achievement might go up a certain point when these other things are real important as well? I mean, we should care about employees being fired. We should care about all these other things. And so you're trying to tell us this is important, we should care about it, but yet you haven't made the case at all that we should care about it.
Yeah, so great comment. So I will make that case. I do make that case. So I think the data we have, and there may be some achievement and test score skeptics in the room. I think the best data we have suggests that educational quality, measured at least partly through achievement, does impact longer life outcomes. It impacts employment, impacts criminal justice involvement, it impacts even teenage pregnancy rates. So I think it's pretty clear that education quality matters. I think it's also clear that educational quality, as measured through year-to-year gains in test scores, are measuring one dimension of that. Not saying everything that is measured by test scores, but an important dimension of that. And so I think those two things are pretty compelling. Now, the second part of the argument is one where you might take issue with me, which is, I believe you. I believe that schools are important. I disagree that they're more important than adult jobs. And again, that's I think a value question where reasonable people can disagree. And maybe I'm wrong. But I think if I was to pose this question for you for any other service, the trade-offs I'm talking about, the kinds of trade-offs that we accept for education, we would not accept for other services. And I'll give you a concrete example. So we're doing a survey now, a national survey with Michael Hartney, where we have a split sample. And half of the voters, we're going to ask, there's a low-performing school, it's gotten sufficient funding, student outcomes continue to be really bad. The community says, we don't just care about student outcomes, we think this is a community institution, and you shouldn't close it. So do you think those considerations are going to be, should be relevant? And we suspect many people will say yes. So then the other half of the sample gets the same question, but instead of public schools, we say public hospital. We say we have a public hospital, it gets a lot of funding, and patient outcomes are terrible. And if you close the hospital, kids can go to a better hospital. But people say this public hospital is a community institution and shouldn't be closed. How much weight would you put on that consideration? And I suspect in that survey, we'll see many more people saying, yes, the school is a community institution, and even if it's bad for kids, you got to keep it open, that are not going to say that for the public hospital. And it's not obvious to me why that should be the case. If we do that question and we ask about public water systems, we say you have a water system that serves contaminated water where you're getting dysentery and cholera, but hey, there's a lot of jobs on the line, and we could shut down the water and get you piped water from the community nearby, but you'll lose the jobs. Is that worth it? Again, I suspect most people will say, you can't ask the constituents to drink bad water to protect jobs for adults. And yet, for some reason in education, those arguments get taken seriously and get more weight than they would in any other policy area that impacts constituents. And I think the only difference is education is about kids, and all those other areas directly implicate adults. And when adults have skin in the game, when it's about you going to a subpar hospital or you getting contaminated water, it just hits a little bit differently than bad schools that affect somebody else and who has kids that maybe it's not you who's voting in the election. So that's my best answer, and maybe you find that unsatisfying, and then I probably can't convince you. But hopefully, for most of you, that comparison will at least resonate a little bit. Was it over here? Yeah. 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 Yeah, I think that's right. And I would say it's not just about investment. Again, and this is a conversation we can have. I don't think it's an issue about resources. DC public schools were very generously funded during this period. So it wasn't the case that DC had less resources than many other school systems. Maybe they didn't have enough given the disadvantage of the students they faced. But I think it's clear that they were not spending that money to maximize the return on investment, to maximize return on opportunity for students. And so I think it's not just about caring about the investment, but caring enough that once you invest the money, you actually care about the results that you get. And especially if those results are going to come at the expense of or upset or piss off other vested adult interests, whether employees, whether property owners, whether other groups that might care about other dimensions of education that are not about academic opportunity for kids. Yeah, either one, yeah. 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 So 100%. I mean, I think a lot of these issues are just hardwired. But I mentioned I do have the second half, the positive. And so I'm going to give you 3 concrete things we can do. And they're exactly kind of in your framing. It is about realigning incentives and making it just a little bit more on the margin. I'm not saying these are silver bullets. These are probably have small positive impacts, but could on the margin really bring those incentives in line. And I'll talk about them in just one second. Yeah, it's right next to you. Yeah. 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 Yeah, great question. So I think there's education scholars in the room who might disagree with me, but I think there's two things we know about education. One is a lot of things are outside the control of the schools, right? A lot of things are happening in home. And when you do the math, by the time you graduate, kids have spent like 10% of their hours in school, 90% outside of school. So a lot of things that are happening we can't control. The one thing we can control, the most important in-school factor, is teacher quality. So if you're not giving the best, if you're not putting the best teacher, particularly if you're not putting the best teacher in front of the most disadvantaged students, you're leaving, like, that's the only area where you can have any impact. And that was the core issue in DC. That was why they have to replace the teachers at Sousa, because as you saw, they were the dumping ground. Sousa was a dumping ground for teachers nobody at other school wanted. And so they got sent to Sousa. And so there was no way to improve the school without improving teacher quality. And the reason why DC schools post Michelle Rhee have improved so much, many argue, is because of the revolutionary teacher evaluation system she put in place. It's called Impact. That is all about really quality, high quality teacher assessment. Part of it's to help teachers improve, but part of it's also just to change the composition of teachers. That there are teachers who maybe not great, and maybe they should go do something else. And maybe there's a way to bring in new teachers who are better. And I think all of the evidence suggests the reason why DC has seen the gains as it has is because they have made improvements in the quality of the teaching workforce, which is what cost Adrienne Fenty and Michelle Rhee her job. So they both fired. Their successor, Vincent Gray, who runs on a platform, an anti-Michelle Rhee platform, puts in her successor that essentially keeps all the policies in place because she knows those are the policies that are actually working, and they continue to work over the course of the next decade. Again, her successor is much less controversial. She's not on the cover of Time magazine and giving crazy interviews. But I think it really shows you the importance of teacher quality and why, again, if voters, the one thing they didn't like about is firing teachers. If you have bad teachers, it's unavoidable that you have to fire them if you want to improve teacher quality, if that's the main in-school factor that you can control. Yes, and that. Yeah, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it's a good question. I think it's hard to say now. I think there are cases. So I think DC is an interesting case because it was really the teachers union that mobilized the opposition to vote out Adrienne Fenty. They ran the campaign. And shortly after they fired Adrienne Fenty, the teachers union actually fired the teachers union president. And he went to work for Michelle Rhee afterwards at her new organization called Students First. So, I think there's variation. And there are places like Chicago where I think the teachers union are particularly a barrier to reform. I think there's other places. Kansas City is a great example where Kansas City, in about 20 years ago, for many reasons, had a budget crisis. They closed a third of the schools. They particularly used that as an opportunity because when you close a third of the schools, you have to let go of some of the teachers. They're very strategic. They made sure that as part of that, they prioritized the best teachers. And they did that with the cooperation of the teachers union. So I think it varies. But again, teachers unions are there to advocate for teachers. Just like here, you guys have a faculty union. I'm sure they advocate for the interests of Florida State faculty. And often those interests align. When they don't align, I guarantee you the Florida State faculty union will advocate for faculty, even if it means at the expense of your learning. So I think we shouldn't expect, that's their job, right? They're there to represent their members. And so I think the same thing is true with teachers unions. So let me, I know a few more hands. Let me just give you like the positive side to answer your question. Then maybe we continue the conversation. So what can we do? Again, I think a lot of this is just as hardwired. There's not much we can do, but I think there's three things that have on the margin evidence for efficacy. So one is very, very modest, which is just change when we have school board elections. So one of the legacies of the progressive era is that we have school board elections in most places off cycle. So they're not in November of even years. They're like in April of odd years. And one consequence of that is turnout is really, really low. So there are many communities where less than 10%, less than 20% of registered voters vote. So we know, we have compelling evidence, and this is work that I've done and many other folks have done, that when you sync elections, when you move school board elections to November of even years, especially presidential years, turnout goes up dramatically. So if you care about voter participation, you should celebrate that. It goes from like 20% to 60%. But more importantly, there's compositional changes. So it turns out when you have on-cycle elections, a much larger share of voters has school-age children. So more voters have skin in the game. And so if we think voters that have skin in the game are going to think about these issues differently, it's not going to be a purely symbolic thing. I think that's a good thing. And there's evidence complementing this, mostly from California. California is a big state with about 1,000 districts that vary in election timing. So you can have a really nice causal design. And so this is some work from Julia Payson at UCLA. She finds that, and so this, I'll just explain these graphs very fast. So on the x-axis is the state measure of school quality. It's called API, the Academic Performance Index. It's the official kind of school quality measure. On the y-axis is the share of the votes that school board incumbents win when they run for re-election. And if elections work, if voters are rewarding improvements in school quality, you should see a positive line, a positive slope. And the big takeaway is you only see a positive slope in California in school board elections in November of even years. You don't see that relationship for all other school board elections. So not only are there more parents voting, but it suggests that the voters who are voting on cycle care more about academic quality. And so to me, this is win-win-win, right? Higher turnout, which many people like, more voters with skin in the game, and more accountability pressures on sitting incumbents, because now they know if our schools are not improving, voters are going to care and might vote me out of office. So if we think that's the main mechanism by which democracy works, that's a great way to make democracy work a little bit better. So this second reform is making information more salient. I think one reason most voters don't care about academics is like it's really hard to get that information, and it's really hard to get good information. So this is a subtle point, but often when we look at school quality, if we look on great schools, that's not measuring school quality. That's mostly measuring student SES. It's measuring the composition of students. And so if we want to measure actual school quality, we really have to focus on year-to-year gains, because that subtracts out most of those things happening outside the classroom, things that are not changing dramatically from year to year, and isolating school quality. And it turns out that information is really hard to get. It's even harder to get than the bad metrics we already have. So we shouldn't be surprising that when you make the information really hard to get, voters are not going to pay much attention to it. So I would make this a top priority. And in fact, I would say we're moving in the wrong direction. So there are many states that have decided to have partisan elections for school boards. So traditionally, 90% of school board elections are nonpartisan. There are no party labels. Most recently, Indiana, a few years before that, Tennessee, and now many other states are thinking about adding party labels. And the idea is we want transparency. We want voters to know who they're voting for, which kind of makes sense if you care about adults picking other adults that share their partisanship. It doesn't make sense if we want voters who care about academics. And we have really good evidence from judicial elections. So judges are elected in many states. Some states have partisan judicial elections. Some have nonpartisan. And by comparing those across the states, we know when you introduce party labels, you know what gets crowded out is performance information. So if we want voters to care more about academic performance, then the last thing you would want to do is make the elections partisan, because that will have the exact opposite effect. And in fact, again, if we want to change the design of the ballot, which I'm totally for, I would not add party labels. What I would add is the actual growth ratings for the districts. When you go to vote, you can have the name of the race. It would be, the school district, and you can have the A through F or 1 to 5 star rating. Put it right on the ballot. Very subtle. We're not making voters care about academics if they don't want to, but it's there. It's a reminder on the last step before they vote. I think it's a simple behavioral change that mechanically, I suspect, would increase the salience of academic considerations and thereby increase the accountability pressures on school boards to make things better. And then the last one, which is probably the most controversial, but James will, I think, probably love the most, is democracy has strengths, it has weaknesses. It turns out markets have strengths and weaknesses. And can we get the best of both? Can we leverage other ways of governing schools to address some of the shortcomings? And so I think school choice has a lot of evidence behind it. And when I say school choice, I think often when we think about school choice, it could be vouchers or ESAs or charter schools. I think we're thinking about the impact on the students who take advantage of those options. I think that's really not the right way to think about it. Most kids will continue to attend public schools in most communities. And so the reason why school choice matters is not for the small subset of students who opt out to go to the voucher schools or charter schools, but it's really the competitive pressures, the fact that now there's an exit option. And it creates accountability pressures on the district, that if we're not providing a good product to parents, they might be a minority of the electorate, so they might not be able to vote us out. But guess what? If we're not giving a good product, they will leave and they will take the tax dollars with them. And so it creates pressure on districts to serve kids better. And Florida is actually, I think, a great example. The best evidence on the competitive effects of schools is by David Figlio, an economist, looking at Florida over time and the expansion of the voucher program. And it finds that not only does the program get better, but the traditional public schools who face the greatest increase in private school competition see the biggest academic gains. So it's really the exit threat. Now, this is where maybe James and I will disagree. I think choice in general is great. I think how you do choice really matters. And so I personally think the best programs are not the universal programs that we're seeing now, where everybody can take the money and go wherever they want. I would love us to focus on kind of the old school targeted programs for kids in schools that are most underperforming. And there's really two reasons why I think targeted programs are better. If the reason why choice has positive impacts is through competition, who schools are competing for really matters, right? So the kinds of things that schools do to retain middle class and upper class parents are going to be different than the kinds of things that schools do to retain disadvantaged minority kids in low income areas. And so if we think the latter kids are the ones who are least well served now, we want all the competitive pressures to focus there. And if we have universal programs that go to everybody, we're effectively, I think, watering down some of those incentives. Because again, it's going to be different kinds of competition. So those are the three things I think that together in complement, I think would work well, because information, not only is it helpful for voters on election day, might be helpful for parents when they're exercising school choice, figuring out which school is actually better rather than which school just happens to enroll wealthier students. So those are the three institutional reforms I would suggest that I think would help modestly, but I think help align some of the incentives that are currently misaligned. All right, so I'll turn it over back to the Q&A. Yeah. Yeah.
So in that regard, like basically part of this, especially in like cities like Chicago, like almost kind of asking like teachers metaphorically kind of like put down the guns to instead like get no benefits or lose their jobs, and then you're seeing like the community members, like you're seeing their community members lose their jobs, you're seeing them struggle with especially in cities that have like a very difficult job market. So I think without a measure to like, not even talk about the economic like aspects of this, but without a measure like guaranteed employment or something where you could actually see struggle with a different job, like I think something like that would probably help the teachers like work with them a lot better. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I mean, you might be right. Again, I think, if you talk to teachers, like most teachers are good teachers. I think most union leaders will say most of our members are good members, and the bad teachers make our profession look bad. It's the same thing that like police unions, like the regional police unions will say most police officers are good officers, but there's a few bad apples. It's our job to advocate for them. We know they're bad. We know that they suck, but they're a member. Under our contract, we have to represent them in discipline. We have to fight them being fired. But privately, they say, yeah, we don't want them in this job either, right? So I think realistically, most educators and most union leaders, again, if they weren't required to kind of advocate for all the members, I think would be happy actually with efforts to improve the quality of workforce, particularly again if there's compensation. So one of the things that happens in DC, the way Michelle Rhee is able to do this is she says, we're going to bring in this new evaluation system, and you don't have to participate. You want the old system, that's fine. But if you opt into the new system, you'll get a massive pay increase. And so in DC, the teachers that shift into this higher accountability system, again, not the terrible teachers who are fired, but the rest of the teachers, they do so voluntarily because she makes it worth their while through financial incentives. So I think it's along the lines of what you're describing. And it's not necessarily about, again, alternative employment, it's just more accountability, but we compensate you as a professional so that the extra risk is worth it now because there's upside gain for you as well. Yeah. 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 I mean, it's a good comment. I think I'll try not to upset many people in the room. So I think, first of all, I think our perception of teacher salaries versus the reality, if you look at public opinion, people dramatically underestimate how much teachers make. I think the other important point is if you look at the data of teachers who leave teaching and get other jobs, or people who go into teacher training programs but can't get a job as a teacher. And if you look at administrative data from unemployment insurance, teachers get paid more than the alternative. So teachers who leave teaching, get other jobs, take a pay cut, or at least roughly the same. So I think one of the challenges is it's true that teaching is not a high-paying profession. Some of it is a function of kind of the pool of people we're hiring. So, I think, teaching is generally not seen as a high prestige occupation. So it's not attracting the same caliber of job applicants as measured by things like ACT scores. So I think there's a chicken or the egg problem. Yes, we should pay teachers better, but we should also pay them better in order to get better quality teachers, right? And I think one of the challenges is often when we talk about teacher pay, we're talking about increasing pay for the current teachers who are maybe not necessarily underpaid relative to their market alternatives. And it's really not obvious how you can do that, right? If you're trying to change compensation while also changing the teaching pool, it's a really tricky system, I think, to navigate. And I think the DC reforms kind of did that because it was really, the main impact was really over time changing the composition of teachers, first of all, who are leaving voluntarily, but also changing the kind of people who are going into teaching in DC to attract a higher caliber of people that would not have considered teaching under the previous compensation model, but also the previous evaluation model. Yep. Yeah, Tyler?
How can you measure success?
Mm-hmm.
Measure different districts?
Yeah.
Favor the national, just so that we can have actual data.
Yeah. I wouldn't necessarily be in favor of that. I don't think we need that, right? So all states have already a state accountability system. Here in Florida, I think you have still the A through F system, and part of that is based on growth. So we already have the data. So in Florida, you can already compare schools. They already get a summative rating based in part on growth. I would like to have more weight on growth, and just take the existing A through F ratings you have in Florida for all of your public schools and put that right on the ballot for the districts. Put that right on the ballot when those school board members are up for re-election. So I think you can do it with the existing infrastructure and data we have in place now.
All right, you guys thank me, or thank me, thank you, Professor Kogan. I want to say again, if you did not sign in and you are here to get extra credit, make sure you see Leela over here, write your name down so we can get it to your professors. This is the first time we've had an event really focused specifically on K-12 education. Education Liberty is my branch of the IGC. If you want to see more events like this, showing up is a good sign, but also reach out to me, talk. I'd love your ideas about what other types of events you would like us to bring in. And I love how Professor Kogan said, James might agree with me on this, he's going to disagree with me. We're going to disagree on things. That is okay. You're in a place where disagreeing with one another should be encouraged, but we work it out through argument, through discussions, all of those sorts of things. So really appreciate the talk today. We appreciate you being here. All of you have a wonderful day. Thank you.
And thank you all for coming.
Thank you.